Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. My name is Katie Wilson from Washington County. In this presentation, I will be talking about stormwater management, the practices that are typically used to control stormwater runoff, and discuss some of the typical maintenance items that are needed to keep these practices functioning properly. This is an educational workshop for homeowners. Okay, so the agenda for this meeting is we're going to introduce what is stormwater, the basics in the background. Then we're going to describe what type of stormwater practices there are. We will get into what's driving this, Washington County Stormwater Ordinances. Then we will be discussing maintenance and examples and photos, and then next steps for landowners. So that is the overall presentation, and there will be breaks. So you can, if you want to skip to a certain portion, you should be able to, at the bottom of the video, find these breaks and skip to it. What is stormwater? Stormwater is rainwater that does not infiltrate or soak into the ground. It is rainwater or melting snow that flows over grass, your driveway, off your roof, through gutters, over roads, that eventually flows into storm drains or the nearest waterway. When stormwater runoff flows over multiple surfaces, it can pick up pollutants such as dirt, grease, and trash before entering a storm drain or waterway. This is a problem because we want to minimize the number of pollutants that go into our waterways in order to keep our streams and lakes healthy and have good water quality. Much of today's water pollution comes from contaminants being carried to water bodies via stormwater runoff that are a direct result from our everyday activities. Let's back up for a minute. If we didn't have any development, most rainwater would naturally infiltrate or soak into the ground. This is important because when water soaks into the ground, it flows underground and then discharges to our streams or replenishes our groundwater. When water flows underground, it is cooled and filtered by the soil before finding its way back to our streams and lakes. By contrast, stormwater runoff is typically warm and contains dirt and other pollutants that it collects when it flows over different surfaces. We want rainwater to infiltrate into the ground because infiltration means cleaner and cooler water flowing into our waterways. This is a graphic showing that when you have a development, your surface runoff increases. You can see on the left graphic, most of the rainwater infiltrates into the ground, and in a natural, undeveloped setting, you only have 4% surface runoff. However, as soon as you start developing an area with buildings, roads, driveways, anything that has impervious surfaces, which means rainwater cannot soak through that surface, you're going to have increased runoff. This is important because all that water that would naturally soak into the ground is now flowing across the landscape into our waterways. The bar graph on the right shows the difference in runoff water between an acre of grass and an acre of pavement. If you collected the runoff from an acre of grass, you would fill a 10-foot by 10-foot room to a depth of a little over 1 foot. Compare that to the runoff from 1 acre of pavement, it would fill the same 10-foot square room to a depth equal to the height of a 4-story building. This slide provides the findings of a study that compared several watersheds at varying levels of development and how stormwater runoff impacted the waterways and the impacts to water quality. A watershed is a water that flows from higher elevations to the lower elevation outlet point. So all the water flowing from higher elevations down to the same lower elevation outlet point is in the same watershed. What this study found is if you don't have development or minimal, so less than 5% development in that watershed, your streams and lakes are cooler in temperature, have better water quality. The stream banks and bottoms are typically stable, meaning they're not dealing with erosion problems from intense rain events. You can find fish, salamanders, insects, sometimes even mussels. However, the more you develop in a watershed, this causes more stormwater runoff. The study found that if you have over 25% development in a watershed, your stream is unhealthy. There is significant decrease in the base flow of streams, and streams are more flashier during rain events from warm stormwater carrying dirt and pollutants that flow directly to these water bodies, decreasing the overall water quality. In these developed watersheds, storm events deliver large volumes of water to streams much faster than what would naturally occur. This results in flooding and stream bank erosion. The warm water from the stormwater runoff will also stress, displace, or kill less tolerant fish, mussels, and salamanders living in the streams from all the debris and sediment that is being brought to it. This is an example of stormwater runoff entering a stream. The picture on the left shows a stream. You can see the water is clear and it has a kid fishing. Then, after a rain event, you can see all the stormwater runoff that entered the stream. Think of all the storm drains that dumped into the stream, and you can visually see how much dirt and other pollutants it picked up. So after a rain event, do you wonder why the water is brown? This is why. This is what's happening. That's a result of all the runoff that's not infiltrating into the ground, but flowing overland into our storm drain systems and then into our water. To reiterate, you can see in this graphic that your rainwater is going to pick up any pesticides you put on your grass, any litter, fertilizer, yard waste, auto fluids if you change your oil in your driveway. It'll pick up any dirt, even pet waste if you don't pick up after your pets. This runoff water will eventually run into the storm drains. Most of the time, stormwater is not treated before it enters streams and waterways. So all that pollution is going directly into a stream. So how do we increase infiltration and treatment of stormwater runoff and still have development? It is through stormwater management and the practices that promote infiltration to capture and treat stormwater runoff. There are typically two types of stormwater practices that are utilized in developments to help treat stormwater runoff before it enters our water bodies. Let us examine how these function and why a development would choose one over the other. The first is stormwater ponds. You can see on the picture on the right depicts a stormwater pond. The second is an infiltration basin, and I'll show you a picture of one of those in a later slide. The third and somewhat common practice in this area of the state that some developments have been able to incorporate is natural kettles as part of their stormwater management plan. A natural kettle is a natural depression that can be used to capture and infiltrate stormwater runoff. All these practices are intended to capture the stormwater runoff and remove pollutants and slow the amount of runoff from development before the stormwater reaches the water body. But how do they do that? A stormwater pond is designed to catch the stormwater runoff. You can see in the diagram there are many parts to a stormwater pond. First, let's start on the left. You can see the inlet swale. If your subdivision has grass, waterways, or ditches, those ditches are engineered to flow towards the inlet swale and into the stormwater pond. You can also have inflow from a storm sewer system. Some developments are designed with storm inlets that are connected and lead into stormwater ponds. Once the stormwater runoff reaches the pond, if there's dirt, sediment, or any pollutants attached, they'll settle to the bottom. Next, we have the outlet pipe and riser, which is designed to be at a certain elevation so the water will slowly be released from the stormwater pond before discharging to adjacent wetlands or water bodies. In summary, stormwater practices intercept all the stormwater and then slowly release it. The this slow release improves the water quality by letting dirt and pollutants settle out to the bottom, and the water discharged from the stormwater pond is typically going to be cooler, cleaner, and slower, so it's not going to rapidly overwhelm the water body it's discharging to. A couple more components I'll quickly touch on. There's typically a berm around the stormwater pond, so the pond is in a depression. There's a clay liner at the bottom, and the clay liner is to make sure that water doesn't infiltrate, as the pond is designed to hold water, essentially having a permanent pool. A forebay is another component which isn't shown in this picture, but I will show it to you on the next graphic. We also have a safety shelf, which comes out from the edge and is shallow, and it goes mostly all the way around the pond. If you can see my cursor, you can see how it's shallow on either side. This is so cattails and or other vegetation can grow around the edge, and that's for several reasons. One, if you have thicker vegetation around the edge, it'll deter geese and other wildlife. Typically, we don't want a lot of birds or wildlife in here because we want to keep the pond as clean as we can. Secondly, it will deter children from entering the pond, and if they do, it's a shallow area and not a sudden drop-off so they can climb out. The safety shelf leads to a deeper area where all your dirt and other pollutants are going to settle to the bottom. The last component is an emergency spillway or overflow channel. This is for cases where we get really heavy rain events and perhaps the pond is filling up faster than what can be let out of your riser or outlet pipe. In this case, the overflow spillway is designed so water can flow out this way if the outlet pipe gets overwhelmed. So these are all the typical components of a stormwater pond. I have a couple photos so you can visually see in real life what these components look like. You can see that this is a stormwater pond and the inlet swale is where the red arrow is. Typically, these inlet swales have riprap and that keeps erosion from occurring. You can see this one is hooked up to a storm sewer drain design. So all the water from this neighborhood will flow into the storm drain and discharge into the stormwater pond. This photo shows a forebay. This is a preliminary smaller pond to the main stormwater pond where the inlet swale flows into. The forebay and the main pond is separated by a small berm. The water can easily flow to the main stormwater pond. Forebays aren't on every design, but it's pretty typical. If you can see my cursor, you can see this is the forebay in front of the photo. There's a shallow berm so water can still spill over and get into the main pond. The forebay's function is so the sediment settles first in this area before flowing to the larger stormwater pond. So if all the sediment settles in the first smaller area, the forebay, if it fills up, it's a lot easier to dredge this area out than the whole pond. You can also see the safety shelf in this picture where the cattails are growing around the edge. And you can also see that the berm goes all the way around the pond, if you can see my cursor. Next, we have examples of outlet structures. Outlet structures can all look a little different, but their function is the same. Some differences in these examples, you can see that there's oftentimes a small hole cut out in the riser, and that's where the water, if it reaches this elevation, will slowly pour into the riser before flowing out of the stormwater pond. The picture on the left is an example of a V-notch outlet weir. The higher the water pools behind the weir, the faster it will flow out. 3 of these are examples in an infiltration basin. The small holes are still in an outlet riser, but if the water reaches the top of the pipe, it will discharge at a high rate through the outlet pipe. The photo on the right, you cannot see it, but down here there's also a hole. And when the water reaches this elevation, it will again flow out of the stormwater pond and through the outlet. What happens to the water once it flows out of the stormwater pond? Typically, these are connected to a swale or channel that looks like this. These are all outlet pipes that lead to a riprap channel and then to a water body, wetland, or a lower area. The picture on the left has its outlet pipe discharging to a steeper hillside, so it's riprap lined to help prevent erosion. If a lot of water is flowing out after a high rain event, it won't erode the back of the berm away. So the cool, clean, treated water will flow out of the stormwater pond and into these channels. Next is emergency overflow spillways. You can see two examples in these photos. You can hopefully see the rock line spillway in the berm, and you can see it's at a lower elevation than the rest of the berm. You can see my cursor. I'm circling it right now. So if for some reason the outlet pipe gets clogged and the water elevation rises, or if there's an extremely heavy rain event and this pond gets really full, water can safely flow out of this spot of the stormwater pond without blowing out the berm. The photo on the right is another example, but this is an infiltration basin. There's no water, but if it fills up with water, this is the emergency spillway. Same concept. Every stormwater pond has engineered drawings identifying specific details and their components. They typically look like this. You'll have your elevations, which say what the desired depth of the water is. It will list where your forebays are and where your inlet swales are. This drawing has two forebays. One in the upper right, you have a storm drain coming into the forebay. Then you have the main stormwater pond. You have another forebay and another storm drain connecting to it. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, you have your outlet pipe and riser leading out of the pond. This is a cross-section, which is also part of the engineering design for a stormwater pond. You can see this is the berm on the right, on the left, starting at the left, going right. Then you have your safety shelf. Then your forebay, which catches your initial sediment. Then a small berm in between the two ponds, and then your main pond. And then you can see your safety shelf that goes up to the right and then leads to your outlet structure and outlet pipe leading out of the pond. So this is a typical cross section. It also lists slopes and elevation depths. Okay, let's talk infiltration basins. I've mentioned it a couple times before, but let's walk through it. Infiltration basins are not designed to hold water. Sometimes you have a forebay that does hold water, and sometimes you don't. It just depends on the design. So keep that in mind. You will oftentimes have the same components with infiltration basins as you have with your stormwater pond. You have your inlet swale or inflow coming from a storm drain. As runoff flows into your infiltration basin, there may be additional practices to ensure infiltration instead of it designed to hold water. There may be material added to increase infiltration, like adding sandy soils, a stone trench, or piping connected to more gravelly soils below the surface. This is all designed to increase the speed of water infiltrating into the ground. So ideally, all the water coming into this practice will infiltrate, and there won't be any water going out of the outlet pipe. So these are typically dry basins. Here are a couple of photos. You can see it just looks like a grass depression, but they're designed to handle stormwater and infiltrate it quickly. You can see here is a riprap inlet swale. And this is where all the water is going to run into the basin area and soak into the ground. I'll briefly touch on this, but you can plant certain plants that they're more geared towards infiltration basins. Prairie plants have really good root systems and really deep roots, so they'll break up and create lots of cracks in the ground, which speeds up water soaking into the ground. In this diagram, you can see how little roots turf grass has compared to other species of prairie plants. You can see some of them have really long roots that are multiple feet in length, which aids in infiltration. All right, so now that we have the background, let's get into why we're giving this presentation. Why are we here? Most municipalities have adopted an ordinance to control erosion at construction sites and to control stormwater runoff from development. In many communities across the state, they may have separate construction site, erosion control, and stormwater management ordinances. But in Washington County, we have a combined erosion control and stormwater management ordinance. Prior to 1997, the county still reviewed developers' erosion control and stormwater plans under a land division ordinance. But the majority of the stormwater standards and design requirements were still being developed and thus not specifically identified. One of those requirements under development was identifying who is responsible for the maintenance of the installed stormwater practices. Currently, Stormwater Ordinance requires every development or subdivision that implements a stormwater practice to state who will maintain the stormwater practice and required a recorded maintenance agreement. Who implements these ordinances? In Washington County, we have town zoning. We let each town decide. They could either adopt the county's model erosion control and stormwater management ordinances or create their own. The county can administer a town's ordinance through an intergovernmental agreement with a town, or if a town did not want to adopt their own erosion control or stormwater management ordinances, the county will administer the county ordinance in the town. If your project lies within any city, village, or the township of Jackson, township of Kewaskum, and township of Wayne, stormwater management is administered through their ordinance and permitting office. So if your development lies within one of these communities, the information presented on the next slide does not apply to you, and you should reach out to your community for information related to your stormwater practices. I mentioned in a previous slide that Washington County signed intergovernmental agreement between all but 3 townships for the administration of an erosion control and stormwater management ordinance. Part of that agreement identifies what the county will do related to long-term maintenance of stormwater practices. We told the towns that we would develop and maintain a database of stormwater practices, conduct periodic on-site inspections, provide notification to responsible party when maintenance action is needed, and assist with any enforcement related to practice maintenance. A notification would be when serious maintenance is required and would include established deadlines. The town and county can jointly enforce maintenance requirements with the town using their special assessment authority to recover any costs incurred if the town or county performs that maintenance described in the notification. And then a disclaimer with the intergovernmental agreement is the county doesn't certify the design, construction, or performance of any stormwater management. If we go back to the maintenance agreements I touched on earlier, each development built in the late 1990s or since then, so after the 1997 ordinance, had to have a maintenance agreement. The agreement lists who is responsible for maintenance and also allows access for inspection by the municipality or its administering authority. Maintenance is the responsibility listed on the maintenance agreement. It is not the towns, villages, cities, or counties' responsibility. In older developments, there was not the requirement for such a detailed maintenance agreement. But we are not saying that maintenance responsibility was not defined or needed. It was just that the ordinance did not require a separate maintenance agreement to be recorded. So if you're living in an older neighborhood, that might be why you're not aware of this responsibility. In some cases, the maintenance and responsibility were stated in a developer's agreement, homeowners association, identified on a plat, or maybe does not exist. But it's still good to be aware of what stormwater practices are in your neighborhood and what you can do to keep them functioning properly. Specifically, what the 1997 ordinance said regarding maintenance. This is the language it uses. It describes the long-term maintenance needs. It indicates where the drainage and access easements are. The maintenance agreement, it's supposed to identify the entity and individual's responsibility. Those are a couple examples of what it's required. This is an example maintenance agreement form. This is what usually is attached to your property's deed. It describes the developer and then will describe the landowner and the undivided interest. What does this mean? Let's talk about an example. So this is an example of a smaller subdivision. There are 4 homeowners with the stormwater pond, and in the agreement language, it will say an undivided 1/4 interest will be assigned to each property owner. So each property owner is 25% responsible for the maintenance and function of the stormwater. This is an example of some of the prescribed maintenance needs per practices identified in the maintenance agreement, describing what the property owners are responsible for. So, for example, under erosion repair, let's say you notice there's erosion in your inlet swale. Say the riprap is washed away after a big rain event. The maintenance agreement states that areas showing signs of erosion shall be repaired, reinforced, and revegetated. So this is a great guideline for maintenance. So why is maintenance important? These stormwater practices do not last forever. Forebays can fill up with sediment that settles to the bottom from your stormwater runoff. Outlet structures can become clogged and not function as designed. The clay liner might crack and the water might not hold as much water as it was designed to hold. There can be erosion issues. Trees can be growing on the berms or in the pond. This is a concern because tree roots can penetrate the clay liner underneath the pond or weaken the berm or cause excessive grass or weedy vegetation, can clog the outlet pipes. We like to see the berms mowed and the vegetation maintained. For the most part, all the stormwater practices we have inspected are functioning well and do not need major cleaning or reconstruction. There are some issues we found that with some care and maintenance, they can be fixed. This is why we decided to provide a broader educational workshop to raise awareness and hopefully inspire most of you to take an active role in maintaining your stormwater practices. For example, we found some basins having large trees growing around them. We found rusted outlet structures, piles of yard debris, retention ponds turning dry. We found some excessive organic buildup. So why should all these issues be addressed? Let's say the outlet is clogged, water is not getting out of the pond as it should, and it's causing flooding. This flooding could potentially affect adjoining properties and buildings, making it a larger issue. So this is a general list of items to look for when inspecting stormwater practices. Take note of any erosion. If everything is functioning, try to determine if the basin area is filling up with sediment, if there's any lawn litter or yard debris dumped in the area, if you notice any animal damage, especially if there are animal burrows. Take a note of overall water quality. Is the water level at the designed water elevation? Are there trees and vegetation growing in areas that there should not be? In the upper right corner, you'll see a picture of a stormwater pond that it's in really good condition. The berm is mowed. You can see that there is some wetland vegetation growing on the safety shelf. You can see the forebay and then the main pond in the background. There is no erosion in the inlet swale, and the water surface seems to be at the right elevation. In the bottom picture, this is an infiltration basin that is well maintained. It is dry, so it's not holding water, which is the purpose of an infiltration basin, so it's doing its job. It's mowed without shrubs or trees growing at the bottom of the basin. The grass in an infiltration basin should be kept between 6 and 12 inches long, which this picture shows. You can recall that those roots from native plants that we talked about earlier could help increase the infiltration even more. Here's some examples to give you a visual of some items that need maintenance. This is an inlet swale and it should have uniform grass cover. The swale in the picture on the left needs some maintenance. It should be reseeded and have uniform grass cover like the inlet swale on the right. This is because when water flows through here, it's going to pick up all that dirt and fill your pond with that sediment. This practice is not doing its job anymore, and we want any runoff to remain as clean as possible before entering your stormwater practice. In this photo, there's a couple piles of yard debris. It looks like maybe a Christmas tree in the upper photo. We don't want any yard debris dumped in stormwater basins or infiltration basins. The bottom image is a pile of leaves placed on the edge of a stream, which we do not like to see either. These piles of leaves provide extra nutrient loads to the drainage system and can clog outlet structures, slow down infiltration rates, and ultimately take away from the capacity of basins. On the county's website, we have a page called Clean Ways for Waterways, and it lists our local towns, villages, and cities' brush, leaf, and collection dates. So keep that in mind if you have yard debris you're looking to get rid of. We are starting to see some issues with outlet structures. These pictures show a cover removed, rusted, or broken. The outlet pipes themselves are showing signs of rusting and should be replaced before there's a failure of the pipe and could lead to structural damage of the berm. The picture on the bottom right shows part of the pipe is rusted through, so that needs some maintenance or replacing to keep the water flowing through these safely and ensure they're functioning properly. The covers or grates are also needed to keep vegetation from clogging the outlet pipe. So we don't want to remove them and we want to replace them if they're broken. This is an example of what we mean when we talk about a little maintenance now can save money down the road and why we recommend controlling trees around your stormwater pond. The picture on the left was taken shortly after the subdivision was created. The difference in the two images is 15 years, but notice how many trees have grown around the pond in the photo on the right 15 years later. If this pond is left alone for another 10 or 15 years, and when it comes time for the pond to be cleaned out or other significant maintenance, there will first be some major expense in tree clearing before anyone can have access to the basin area to clean it out. Trees growing on the berm can weaken the berm with their roots and attract burrowing animals that can be detrimental to the stability of the berm during peak rainflow events as well. So it's important to keep your trees down so we don't have a ring like this. In some cases, there are wet basins that are now dry. The top picture is an aerial imagery of when the stormwater pond was first installed. You can see it was holding water, and then in present day, you can see the pond area is now dry. This pond essentially turned into an infiltration basin, and this can happen for multiple reasons. Perhaps it hasn't rained, it's been dry, and it basically is not receiving as much water as it needs to maintain its water level. This practice as an infiltration basin is still doing its job by filtering the stormwater runoff. The good news is we are not recommending these be turned back into wet basins, but this is just something to be aware of when making a determination of how these practices are functioning. This is an example of erosion in an inlet swale. You can see the rock, the riprap, has been washed away, and so it's not protecting the soil, and you can tell the water is cutting along the banks and carrying all that dirt into your pond. You can see how the muddy water is at the bottom with the photo on the left, which is filling the basin faster than it should be, shortening the lifespan of the practice. During inspections, it's also good to note any wildlife damage that's occurring. In this case, muskrats are burrowing into the clay liner, causing more infiltration and thus lowering the pond surface. Or they could be burrowing through the berms, which again, be concerned about their stability if this happens. In some cases, invasive species can pop up. If you ever see these, the red swamp crayfish, please call us as it's highly invasive. These are some of the more abnormal things to look out for and be concerned about the future and longevity of the stormwater practice. So what can landowners do? What are some typical maintenance activities that can and should be done around these stormwater practices? For starters, you can remove any debris or sediment near the inlet swale, outlet pipe, or overflow spillway. This keeps our water flowing properly through the system. You should repair any erosion you see or replace riprap by adding more stones if needed. You can remove trees or weeds by either spot applying herbicide, cutting them, or pulling them. And you can remove any excess dead plant material in early spring. You can also make sure your inlet and outlet structures are working properly by removing any debris that's clogging them. In the bottom picture, you can see an outlet structure that was completely filled with dirt. So taking the time to remove the dirt so it drains properly is important. The picture on the right shows that done. The pictures I showed earlier of the removed grate or broken basket on top of the outlet pipe, these are there to keep the outlet from getting clogged and should be repaired or replaced. For infiltration basins, you can consider replanting native species. Native species typically have better root systems that promote infiltration, and then you can herbicide any invasive weeds. For wet stormwater ponds, you can visually check the sediment depth of your pond. Are they getting full? Do you know their design depth? These are all items that are important to monitor. For developments that utilize natural kettles, which are a natural depression in the landscape, these practices are in the woods. So instead of constructing a stormwater pond, it's basically nature's already constructed one for you. Natural kettles should be dry and are selected because they are good at infiltrating water. In some cases, you might not even know that this is a practice for stormwater management because, like I said, it's typically in the woods and it wasn't constructed. It's important to know where they are in your neighborhood. So if you know where they are, you're not dumping your yard waste or debris in it without knowing it's actually functioning stormwater practice. Maintenance of natural kettles are fairly simple. Most cases, you just need to monitor it, making sure the water is still infiltrating. If the water starts backing up and is not infiltrating anymore, you're seeing some flooding issues, this could be a sign it's potentially stopped working and functioning. As far as drainage channels leading into stormwater practices, these should be mowed 2 to 3 times a year, and you want good grass growth, preferably 6 to 8 inches tall. You want to keep these drainage channels vegetated, but not overgrown with shrubs or trees. And you want to keep it clear of debris to keep clear of debris to keep the water flowing. Okay, I just gave you a lot of information. So what are your next steps? First, take a look at your maintenance agreement attached to your property's deed to find out what you're responsible for. If your neighborhood is older than 1997, you likely won't have a maintenance agreement like the example shown in this presentation. But it is still good to know where your stormwater practices are and maintain them. Next, get together with your neighbors and have a discussion about these practices. Go out and inspect your stormwater practice. Find out, where is it? Have you ever looked at it before? Have you inspected it? If you are not sure about the details of a specific practice or have questions about the various aspects of maintenance, you can always call us or your local municipality, and staff will meet you to go over the specific practices in your development and talk over any questions you have. Then, after you've done your inspection, you can create a list of possible maintenance items that need to be done. Then, think safely. You can decide if you can do these maintenance items safely by yourself or if you need to enlist a professional. For example, if your stormwater pond has large trees, maybe you need to enlist a professional to cut them down. If they're smaller and you feel comfortable using a chainsaw, think safety. So take the time to think about what you're doing. Safety protection when handling a chainsaw, it's typically recommended people wear steel-toed boots, chaps, gloves, and safety glasses. Always do a 360 check around you to make sure that your area is clear. If a larger tree has fallen into the pond's basin, think if some of it can be removed in the winter after it freezes. This might be an easier way to deal with a tree that's fallen into a pond is dealing with it in the winter. You can report any issues or concerns to us, and remember, if you don't feel comfortable doing any maintenance, you can enlist a professional. We are promoting our first ever Stormwater Practice Maintenance Day this coming Earth Day, April 22nd. We will be on call, and we're hoping you and your neighbors can get together and complete some of the maintenance identified in the presentation. Keep in mind, this is not a one and done event. Some of these projects are going to be work in progress, so don't get overwhelmed. Identify a couple items you can do this year and then keep chipping away at it. We will be around all day on April 22nd or before to answer questions. If you are unsure of something or not sure if something needs to be fixed, call us. We will come out and take a look. It's key to remember proactive maintenance is going to reduce costs in the long run, and you want to keep these systems functioning. You don't want them filled up with sediment and debris and for them not to be doing their job. We want them to filter our stormwater runoff and improve our water quality. We are also asking you to share your success. We have set up a Facebook event for Stormwater Practice Day, this Earth Day, April 22nd. If you and your neighbors are doing some maintenance, we are encouraging you to post pictures of your activity, even if you are just doing a little cleanup. Please try and take some before and after photos so other people can see examples of what everyone's doing. You can also email us photos. Like I mentioned before, feel free to call us with questions or issues. If you feel some larger maintenance needs to get done, consider creating a maintenance budget with your neighbors and everyone chipping in funds for a couple years to help spread out the cost. Here's our contact information. Paul Sebo is our department head and can also help answer any questions. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this important topic on stormwater management and maintenance. I really enjoy talking about it, and I think it's really important to talk about this issue and continue to ensure our practices are functioning for the benefit of water quality. Thank you again.